The blind woman pressed her hand against the dirt road, then whispered, "They found me." Elias Turner had lived long enough to know that some voices carried fear different from ordinary fear. This one sounded old, heavy, like somebody hearing thunder long before the storm reached town. The wind rolled across the Kansas plains in long waves that evening, dragging dust over the dry fields and rattling the loose boards on Elias's barn. His farm sat alone nearly 12 miles outside Red Hollow, where the land flattened into endless brown grass and forgotten fences. Most folks passed by without stopping. Poor farms had a smell people recognized from a distance. Smoke, sweat, empty cupboards. Elias leaned against the wooden post beside his porch, one rough hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had long since lost its color. The coffee inside tasted burned. Most things in his life did these days. His cornfield had failed twice that season. Half his chickens were gone. One mule limped from an old injury he couldn't afford to treat. And yet the strangest thing about that evening wasn't the hunger sitting quietly in his stomach. It was the woman walking alone through the dust storm like she already knew where she was going. Elias narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. At first he thought she might have been lost. Then he noticed something that made the hairs on his neck rise. She never looked down, never searched the road. Her cloudy eyes stared somewhere far beyond the horizon, while her bare feet stepped carefully around rocks and wagon ruts as if the earth itself guided her. The woman wore faded Apache clothing beneath a dark wool shawl coated in dirt from miles of travel. Her long gray braids swung against her shoulder with every slow step. Thin silver beads hung from one wrist, tapping softly together in the wind like tiny bells. She stopped suddenly near the broken fence beside Elias's field. Her head tilted slightly, listening, not to him, to the ground. Then she knelt carefully in the dust and pressed her palm against the earth. Elias felt something cold settle deep in his chest. The woman whispered 3 words in Apache too soft for him to understand. Then in slow English, barely louder than the wind, she said, "They found me." Before Elias could answer, she collapsed sideways into the dirt. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the porch steps. He crossed the yard fast, boots crunching over dry weeds. Up close, the woman looked older than he first thought. Maybe 60, maybe older. Her hands were weathered like cracked leather from years beneath desert sun. A fresh scrape marked one side of her face, and dust clung to her eyelashes. But what unsettled Elias most was how calm she looked. Not frightened, not desperate, just tired, like someone who had spent too many years running from footsteps nobody else could hear. "Ma'am." Elias crouched beside her carefully. "Can you hear me?" Her cloudy eyes opened halfway. They did not focus on him. They couldn't. Blind. Completely blind. "Water," she whispered. Elias glanced back toward his house. The porch roof sagged. One shutter hung crooked. Inside waited little more than stale bread, weak coffee, and a stove that smoked too much when lit. But out here, nights turned cold fast after sundown, and no decent man left a blind woman alone on open prairie. Especially not one who looked over her shoulder every few seconds like death itself rode somewhere behind her. Elias slid one arm beneath her shoulders and helped her stand. She was lighter than he expected. The woman flinched the moment the wind shifted across the plains. Somewhere far away, almost too distant to hear, came the faint sound of horses. The old farmhouse groaned under the prairie wind as Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder and guided the blind woman inside. Warmth barely existed in the place. A weak fire snapped quietly inside the iron stove near the corner, throwing orange light across warped floorboards and walls stained dark from years of smoke. The air smelled like burned coffee, damp wood, and dust carried in from the fields. Elias helped the woman into the only good chair he owned, an old cedar rocker beside the stove. She lowered herself carefully without a word, her fingers brushing across the worn armrests as if reading the shape of the wood. Outside, the wind howled harder against the barn. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses let out a nervous cry. Elias glanced toward the window before pulling off his hat. "You hungry?" he asked quietly. The woman remained still for a moment. Then she gave one slow nod. Elias walked to the cupboard and opened it carefully, already knowing what waited inside. Half a loaf of stale bread. A jar with barely enough coffee grounds for another morning. 2 potatoes gone soft around the edges. Nothing else. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the empty shelves while the lantern light flickered against the tin plates. Most folks in Red Hollow thought poverty sounded loud. Elias knew better. Real poverty was silent. It lived in cupboards that echoed when opened. He grabbed the bread anyway and warmed it beside the stove while pouring water into a dented kettle. Behind him, the blind woman lifted her face slightly toward the ceiling. Listening again. "You live alone," she said softly. Her English carried a slow Apache rhythm beneath the words. Elias looked back over his shoulder. "Have for a while now. No children. No wife." The answer caught in his throat harder than he expected. "Not anymore." The woman lowered her head slightly, almost respectfully, as though the house itself had already told her everything. Elias placed the warm bread onto a cracked plate and handed it carefully to her. She accepted it with both hands. Thin hands. Cold hands. The kind shaped by long roads and harsh winters. For several minutes, the only sound inside the farmhouse was the crackle of the stove and the wind pushing dust against the windows. Then the woman spoke again. "This house remembers grief." Elias froze beside the kettle. Most people saw his farm and noticed broken fences, dying crops, peeling paint. Very few noticed what stayed hidden inside it. The silence after funerals. The empty chair at the table. The way a lonely house seemed to breathe differently after losing someone it loved. "You some kind of spirit reader?" Elias tried to laugh, but it came out dry. The woman touched the silver beads on her wrist gently. "No. Grief has a sound." Elias stared at her. For a long moment before looking away. Outside, the horses shifted again in the barn. Restless this time. Uneasy. He stepped toward the window and rubbed the fogged glass with his sleeve. Darkness rolled over the prairie in thick waves, swallowing the fence lines and distant hills. Then he saw it. Far across the plains. Tiny moving lights. Maybe lanterns. Maybe riders. Too far away to tell. Behind him, the woman suddenly tightened her grip around the bread plate. "Do not light another lamp tonight," she whispered. Elias turned slowly toward her. Her cloudy eyes faced the door now instead of the fire. "Why?" he asked. For the first time since entering the house, fear crossed her face. Real fear. Quiet fear. The kind that arrived long before danger itself. "Because," she said softly, "they follow fire after dark." The farmhouse stayed dark after that. Elias extinguished the lantern beside the stove until only the weak orange glow from the fire painted shadows across the room. Outside, the prairie stretched beneath cold moonlight and drifting dust, endless and silent except for the restless shifting of horses in the barn. Elias sat near the window with his rifle resting across his knees, though he had no intention of using it. Out here, a rifle mostly existed to make lonely men feel less lonely at night. Across from him, the blind Apache woman remained in the cedar chair beside the stove, perfectly still beneath her wool shawl. Hours passed that way, wind scraping the roof, floorboards creaking softly, the kettle cooling untouched beside the stove. Elias had known silence his entire life, but this silence felt different. It listened back. Around midnight, the horses outside stomped suddenly in unison. Elias looked toward the barn window. "Coyotes?" he muttered. The woman slowly shook her head. "No, then what?" She tilted her face slightly toward the ceiling as though hearing something beyond the walls. "Men who smell like iron and smoke." Elias frowned. "You can hear that from here?" "No," she whispered. "But the horses can." Before he could answer, a sharp knock echoed against the front door. 3 slow knocks. Heavy. Deliberate. Elias stood immediately, boots, scraping the floorboards. The woman did not move, but her fingers tightened around the silver beads on her wrist. Another knock came through the house. Elias stepped toward the door carefully and cracked it open an inch. Cold wind rushed inside carrying dust and the smell of leather. A teenage boy stood on the porch holding the reins of a mule. Billy Harper, son of the blacksmith in Red Hollow. His cheeks looked pale beneath the moonlight. "Mr. Turner," the boy whispered quickly. "Sorry to come this late, but Pa said to warn you." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Warn me about what?" Billy hesitated, glancing past Elias into the dark house. Men came through town asking questions. 3 of them. Riders from down south maybe. Not lawmen. The boy swallowed hard. They were looking for an Apache woman. Blind. Old. Elias felt the cold air settle deeper into his chest. And somebody saw you carrying someone inside your place before dark." Billy shifted nervously. "Folks in town are talking already." Elias looked toward the empty road behind the boy. Nothing moved except dust rolling across the prairie grass. "What kind of men were they?" Billy lowered his voice further. "The kind that smiles too much while asking questions." Behind Elias, the woman finally spoke from the darkness. "Did one wear silver spurs?" Billy froze. His eyes widened toward the room behind Elias. "Why, yes, ma'am." The woman lowered her head slowly. "Then they are closer than I thought." Billy looked ready to climb back onto his mule and disappear. "Pa said you should send her away before sunrise," he whispered. "Town council does not want trouble with Apache riders again." Elias stared at the frightened boy for a long moment. Red Hollow feared anything it did not understand. Feared Apache tribes. Feared strangers. Feared old stories carried by the wind. But the thing Elias noticed most was not fear. It was shame. Billy looked ashamed for even delivering the warning. Elias rested one hand against the doorframe. "Tell your pa thank you." Billy nodded quickly and turned the mule back toward town. Within seconds, he vanished into the dark plains. Elias shut the door carefully behind him. The house fell silent again. He turned toward the woman beside the stove. "Who exactly is chasing you?" he asked quietly. The blind woman lifted her cloudy eyes toward him. Firelight flickered softly across her weathered face. "Men who fear what I remember," she said. Then outside, from somewhere far beyond the fields, came the low, distant sound of hundreds of horses moving together through the night. The sound rolled across the prairie low and steady like distant thunder trapped beneath the earth. Elias stepped onto the porch before he even realized he had moved. Cold wind swept against his coat as the darkness stretched endless beyond the fields. At first he saw nothing. Only moonlight sliding across dry grass and broken fence posts. Then the horses in the barn began reacting again. Not panicking. Not kicking. Kneeling. Elias frowned and moved toward the barn doors carefully. Inside, all 3 of his horses had lowered themselves against the hay. Their heads bowed low. Their ears pinned back toward the eastern plains. Elias had raised horses since childhood. He had seen them spook during storms, fires, and rattlesnakes. He had never seen them kneel. A chill crawled slowly up his spine. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. The blind woman stepped outside wrapped in her dark shawl, silver beads tapping softly together at her wrist. Wind pulled strands of gray hair across her face, but she seemed not to notice the cold. Her cloudy eyes lifted toward the horizon. "They are near now," she whispered. Elias stared at her. "Who?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped off the porch and lowered one hand toward the dirt beside the path. Her fingertips hovered just above the ground, listening, feeling. Then she spoke quietly. "Not soldiers. Not hunters." Elias looked back toward the empty plains. "Then why does it sound like an army?" The woman finally turned her face toward him. "Because fear travels louder than men." The sound grew stronger over the next hour. Hundreds of hooves somewhere beyond the hills, sometimes fading, sometimes returning louder than before. Yet no riders appeared. No lanterns. No voices. Only the endless movement of horses crossing. Dark land beneath the moon. Elias kept feeding wood into the stove while the woman remained awake beside the fire. Neither slept. Near dawn the wind died completely. The sudden silence felt unnatural after hours of distant thunder. Elias rubbed tired eyes and stepped toward the kitchen window. Frost clung to the glass now. Pale blue morning light slowly spilled over the prairie outside. Then he froze. Horses. Everywhere. Hundreds of them stood motionless around the farm. Dark shapes stretching across the fields, beside the barn, near the fences, along the dirt road leading toward Red Hollow. Elias counted until he lost count somewhere past 200. Some black as coal. Some painted with white markings. Some carrying old Apache blankets and braided leather reins. But no riders. Not one. The animals stood perfectly still beneath the pale sunrise fog. Watching the farmhouse. Elias stepped outside slowly, boots crunching against frozen dirt. The nearest horse stood barely 20 feet away, enormous and dark with silver beads woven through its mane. It did not move as he approached, did not fear him. It simply watched him with calm black eyes. Behind him, the blind woman appeared quietly on the porch. The moment she stepped into the morning air, every horse lifted its head together. Elias turned slowly at the sound. Hundreds of animals moving as one. The woman closed her eyes. Her face softened for the first time since arriving at the farm. Almost peaceful now. They waited, she whispered. Elias looked from the endless sea of horses back toward her. Waited for what? Before she could answer, movement appeared along the eastern ridge. Riders. Dozens of them emerging through the morning fog one by one, silent as shadows against the rising sun. Elias felt his throat tighten. The lead rider carried no rifle in his hands. Only a long staff decorated with eagle feathers that moved softly in the cold prairie wind. The blind woman lowered her head slowly. Now, she said quietly, the real storm arrives. The riders came slowly down the eastern ridge as morning light spread across the plains like pale gold spilling over dry earth. Elias counted nearly 40 before the fog swallowed the rest behind them. None shouted. None reached for weapons. The only sound was leather creaking softly and hundreds of horses breathing cold air into the frozen dawn. The lead rider guided a tall gray stallion toward the farmhouse with the calm confidence of someone who had never once doubted he would be welcomed wherever he arrived. He was older than Elias expected. Broad shoulders beneath a dark buffalo hide coat. Long black hair streaked heavily with silver. Feathers tied carefully into one braid near his temple moved gently in the wind. His eyes carried the same strange stillness Elias had seen in the blind woman since the moment she appeared from the dust storm. The rider stopped 20 feet from the porch. Every horse around the farm lowered its head at once. Elias felt the movement more than saw it, like the prairie itself breathing differently. Beside him, the blind woman stepped forward slowly onto the frost-covered dirt. The older rider climbed down from his horse immediately. And then something happened Elias knew the people of Red Hollow would never believe even if they saw it with their own eyes. The Apache rider knelt before the blind woman. Not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, respectfully. His head bowed low enough that the eagle feathers brushed the frozen ground. Every other rider behind him followed. 40 riders kneeling in complete silence while hundreds of horses stood motionless around the farm. Elias stared without speaking. The blind woman reached down carefully until her fingers touched the kneeling rider's forehead. Her weathered hand trembled slightly. "Dakota," she whispered. The man lifted his face then, and for the first time emotion crossed his calm expression. Relief, deep enough to hurt. "We searched 3 states for you," he said softly. "The mountains, the desert rivers, the trading routes." The blind woman smiled faintly. "Yet it was the wind that found me first." Dakota rose slowly to his feet and finally looked toward Elias. The weight of that gaze felt heavier than any rifle Elias had ever faced. Not threatening, measuring. "You gave her shelter," Dakota said. Elias nodded carefully. "Just seemed wrong. Leaving her out there alone." One corner of Dakota's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "Most men fear what they do not understand." Elias glanced around at the riders and endless horses surrounding his dying farm. "I reckon I still do." Dakota studied him for another long moment before turning back toward the blind woman. "Mother," he said quietly. "They said you were dead." Elias blinked. "Mother." The word settled heavily into the cold morning air. Suddenly the silver beads, the riders, the horses, the fear in Red Hollow. It all fit together in ways he did not yet understand. The blind woman rested one hand against Dakota's shoulder. "The earth was not finished with me." Dakota lowered his head again respectfully. "The tribes have waited for your voice." Before Elias could ask another question, movement appeared far down the dirt road leading from town. 3 riders approaching fast beneath a cloud of dust. The moment Dakota saw them, his expression hardened like winter stone. Several Apache riders turned silently in their saddles. Elias recognized the lead rider immediately by the silver shine flashing beneath his boots. Spurs. The same silver spurs Billy Harper had mentioned during the night. Dakota's voice dropped lower than the wind. "They followed her sooner than expected." Elias looked from the approaching riders back toward the blind woman beside him. Her cloudy eyes faced the road now. Calm again. Too calm. "Who are they?" Elias asked quietly. The blind woman answered before Dakota could speak. "Men who steal what does not belong to them," she said softly. Then the nearest horse beside the fence suddenly stamped once against the frozen earth, and every rider turned toward the road in complete silence. The 3 riders slowed as they reached the edge of the farm, and for the first time since sunrise, the prairie no longer sounded alive. Hundreds of horses stood perfectly still beneath the pale morning sky. No snorting, no shifting hooves, just silence thick enough to press against a man's chest. The lead rider removed his hat slowly as his eyes swept across the endless circle of Apache horses surrounding Elias's land. Silver spurs gleamed beneath, his boots exactly as Billy Harper described. The man looked confident when he arrived. He did not look confident anymore. "Well now," he called out with a dry smile that never reached his eyes. "This is quite a gathering for a poor farmer." Elias remained near the porch without answering. Dakota stood beside the blind woman in complete silence, one hand resting lightly against the mane of his gray stallion. The other Apache riders watched without expression. The stranger's smile tightened slightly. "Name is Clayton Mercer," he continued. "My associates and I are searching for an old Apache woman accused of theft." The blind woman lowered her face slightly, almost amused. Dakota finally spoke. "Be careful what lies you carry onto sacred ground." Mercer's jaw flexed beneath the morning light. "Sacred." He glanced around at the dying fields and broken fences. "Looks more like starving land to me." Elias felt the insult land harder than expected, though Dakota did not react at all. The Apache chief simply stepped forward one pace. The movement alone caused several nearby horses to lift their heads instantly. "You crossed 3 territories searching for her," Dakota said quietly. "That is not the distance men travel for stolen blankets or silver." Mercer's eyes narrowed. For the first time, Elias noticed something hidden beneath the man's confidence. Nervousness. Real nervousness. One of Mercer's riders shifted uneasily in the saddle. "We were hired," the rider muttered quickly. Mercer shot him a sharp glance, but the damage was already done. The blind woman slowly stepped off the porch. Every Apache rider lowered their head respectfully as she passed. Elias watched her move through the cold morning air with calm certainty, guided not by sight but by something deeper than sight. The wind itself seemed to part around her. She stopped only a few feet from Mercer's horse. "You seek the canyon," she said softly. Mercer froze. The color drained slowly from his face. Dakota looked toward Elias briefly. "Now you understand," he said. Elias did not understand at all, but he knew he was standing inside a story far older than himself. The blind woman raised one weathered hand toward the eastern hills barely visible through morning fog. "There is gold beneath the sacred valley," she whispered. "Enough to poison every man who hears about it." None of the Apache riders moved. None looked surprised. They already knew. Elias suddenly remembered every rumor whispered through saloons and trading posts over the past year. Prospectors vanishing near Apache land. Surveyors disappearing. Strange maps changing hands for impossible amounts of money. Mercer climbed slowly off his horse. "We offered your people payment," he said carefully. "We offered partnership." Dakota's eyes hardened like frozen river stone. "You offered greed." The blind woman touched the silver beads on her wrist gently. "I was keeper of the horse paths," she said. "The last one alive who remembers the hidden trails through the valley." Elias stared at her. Suddenly the hundreds of horses surrounding the farm made terrible sense. She was not simply Dakota's mother. She was something far greater to them. Memory. Tradition. A living map no outsider could replace. Mercer glanced nervously toward the riders surrounding the fields. "You cannot stop what is coming," he said quietly. "More men will arrive." Dakota looked toward the endless prairie beyond the hills. "Perhaps." Then he turned his gaze back toward Mercer. "But today, this land belongs to silence." At that exact moment, the church bell from distant Red Hollow began ringing wildly across the cold morning plains. The church bell kept ringing across the plains in frantic bursts, carried by the cold wind rolling out from Red Hollow. Elias turned toward town instinctively. Something had changed there. He could feel it. Around the farm, the Apache riders remained silent beneath the pale morning sky, while hundreds of horses stood packed across the frozen fields like shadows carved from smoke and muscle. Clayton Mercer glanced nervously toward the distant sound of the bell. "Looks like your little secret is not secret anymore," he muttered. Dakota ignored him completely. His attention stayed fixed on the road leading toward town. Then, faint at first, another sound drifted across the prairie. Wagon wheels. Dozens of them. Elias stepped closer to the fence line and squinted into the distance. Dust rose beyond the hills south of the farm. A long trail of movement stretched toward Red Hollow. Townspeople. Wagons. Riders carrying rifles across their laps. Fear traveled fast on the frontier. Faster than truth ever could. Within 20 minutes, the first townsfolk arrived near the edge of Elias's property. Men from Red Hollow climbed down from horses with nervous hands hovering near gun belts. Women stood beside wagons clutching children close against heavy coats. Nobody crossed onto the farm itself. Not yet. They only stared at the impossible sight before them. Hundreds of Apache horses. Silent riders. Endless fog hanging low over the fields. Sheriff Wallace Brennan finally pushed his horse forward through the crowd, sweat already darkening the collar of his coat, despite the cold. Elias knew Brennan well enough. Tired man. Not cruel. Just weak in the ways frontier men often became weak when fear gathered in groups. Brennan removed his hat carefully. "Elias," he called out, trying to sound calm. "Mind explaining why your farm looks like the beginning of a war?" Elias glanced back toward Dakota and the blind woman standing quietly near the porch. "Depends," Elias answered slowly. "You planning to start one?" Nervous laughter moved through parts of the crowd before disappearing just as quickly. Nobody felt comfortable laughing around that many Apache riders. Mercer suddenly stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Sheriff," he announced loudly, "these people are harboring information about federal land containing mineral deposits." Dakota's expression never changed, but several Apache riders shifted slightly in their saddles. Not threatening. Ready. Brennan frowned in confusion. "Mineral deposits?" Mercer nodded quickly. "Gold. Enough to build railroads through 3 territories." The moment the word gold reached the crowd, everything changed. Elias felt it happen almost instantly. Fear became greed. Men who looked nervous seconds earlier suddenly stared toward the eastern hills with hungry eyes. Whispers spread through the gathered townspeople like prairie fire through dry grass. Gold. Hidden valley. Apache land. Mercer saw the reaction too. His confidence returned immediately. "That old woman knows where the valley is," he continued, "and these Apache riders intend to keep it for themselves." The blind woman remained completely still while the crowd murmured louder. Then she stepped slowly forward into the cold morning light. Her cloudy eyes faced the people of Red Hollow, though she could not see a single one of them. "Your town is dying," she said softly. The whispers stopped. Even the wind seemed quieter. "The crops fail. The wells dry. Your children leave because there is nothing left to stay for." Several townsfolk shifted uncomfortably because every word was true. The blind woman raised one weathered hand toward the distant hills. "And now men promise salvation buried beneath sacred earth." Mercer smiled slightly. "At least somebody here speaks honestly." But the woman slowly turned her face toward him. "No," she whispered. "Honest men do not chase blind women across 3 states." Silence settled again. Deep silence. Then Elias noticed something strange. Dakota's riders were dismounting one by one. Not for battle. For work. One Apache man quietly lifted a fallen fence post beside the barn. Another began repairing a broken wagon while leaning near Elias's shed. 2 more carried water buckets toward the thirsty horses inside the corral. The crowd from Red Hollow stared in confusion. No rifles raised. No threats spoken. Just Apache riders repairing the farm of a poor white farmer they had never met before. Sheriff Brennan removed his hat slowly and rubbed one trembling hand across his face. "Lord help me," he whispered softly. "I think we may have feared the wrong people all along." The cold morning stretched slowly toward noon as the strange scene around Elias Turner's farm continued unfolding in ways nobody from Red Hollow understood. Apache riders repaired broken fences beside white ranch hands who only hours earlier had arrived expecting war. Women from town quietly passed buckets of water toward tired horses while children peeked nervously from wagon beds, staring wide-eyed at the endless sea of animals covering the frozen prairie. Fear had not vanished completely, but confusion had begun softening it around the edges. Elias stood near the porch watching one Apache rider hammer fresh boards across his collapsing chicken coop with careful, steady hands. "You do not have to fix that," Elias muttered awkwardly. The rider glanced toward him briefly. "My mother says a man who offers shelter should never sleep beside broken walls." Elias looked toward the blind woman sitting calmly in the cedar chair beside the porch. The morning sun touched the silver beads around her wrist while the wind lifted strands of gray hair gently around her face. She looked peaceful now, like someone finally standing where she belonged. Across the yard, Clayton Mercer grew more impatient by the minute. "You people are blind," he snapped toward Sheriff Brennan and the gathered townsfolk. "Do you really think they rode all this way for kindness?" Brennan rubbed his jaw uneasily but said nothing. Mercer pointed toward the eastern hills. "There is enough gold in that valley to change every life standing here." Some men in the crowd shifted again at the word gold. Elias noticed it immediately. Hunger looked different depending on the man carrying it. Some hungered for bread, others for land, others for things bright enough to ruin them. Dakota slowly approached Mercer through the frozen grass. The Apache chief walked without hurry, yet every voice in the yard seemed to quiet as he passed. "You speak of changing lives," Dakota said calmly, "but all I have seen behind your words is death following greed from one territory to another." Mercer laughed sharply. "Spare me the wisdom talk." He stepped closer toward Dakota. "You think the government will let your people keep that valley forever?" Dakota's face remained unreadable. "No," he answered honestly. "Nothing lasts forever." The honesty of the answer unsettled the crowd more than anger would have. Mercer spread his hands toward the townspeople. "Then why should they suffer in poverty while mountains sit full of gold?" Before Dakota could answer, the blind woman slowly rose from the porch chair. Every Apache rider nearby lowered their heads respectfully. Even the horses nearest the house seemed to settle quieter at the sound of her footsteps. She walked carefully across the yard until she stood beside Elias. Her cloudy eyes faced the wind moving across the plains. "When I was a little girl," she said softly, "my father took me into the sacred valley." The crowd listened without speaking. There was gold there even then, rivers carrying sunlight beneath stone. Mercer smiled triumphantly toward the others. But the woman continued, "My father touched the gold once." Her weathered hand lifted slowly toward her chest. Then he told me something I did not understand until I became old. She turned her blind eyes toward the people of Red Hollow. The earth hides dangerous things in beautiful places, so foolish men will reveal themselves. Silence followed her words. Deep silence. Sheriff Brennan lowered his eyes toward the frozen dirt. Several townsfolk shifted uncomfortably away from Mercer now. The blind woman reached slowly into the folds of her shawl and removed something wrapped carefully in old cloth. Elias watched her unfold it piece by piece until sunlight struck polished stone. A map, not paper. Carved leather marked with narrow trails and symbols Elias did not recognize. Mercer inhaled sharply. Every greedy eye in the yard locked onto the object instantly. The blind woman held the map out toward Elias instead of Dakota. "You gave shelter without asking for reward," she whispered. "So now you must decide what kind of men stand upon this land." Elias stared down at the ancient map resting in her trembling hands while hundreds of horses stood silent around the farm and the prairie wind carried the smell of winter coming fast across the plains. The prairie stayed quiet after the blind woman placed the ancient leather map into Elias Turner's hands. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Wind rolled softly through the dry grass. Harness leather creaked somewhere among the horses. Far above the farm, winter clouds drifted slowly across the pale afternoon sky like smoke fading from an old fire. Elias stared down at the carved markings cut into the worn leather. Rivers, trails, symbols older than the town of Red Hollow itself. Enough gold hidden beneath those mountains to pull railroad men, prospectors, soldiers, and grave diggers across half the country. Enough to destroy every peaceful thing touching the valley. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes waiting for his choice. Clayton Mercer stepped forward carefully, his voice softer now. Careful. Tempting. "You know what that map is worth, farmer?" Elias looked at the broken fences around his property. The collapsing barn roof. The thin cattle standing near empty feed barrels. Every hard winter. Every unpaid debt. Every lonely morning drinking burned coffee beside an empty chair. Then he looked toward the blind woman standing beside him in the cold wind. A woman who arrived with nothing except dust on her clothes and fear in her footsteps. A woman everybody else would have turned away. Elias folded the leather map slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I finally do." Mercer smiled faintly. "Then you understand what comes next." Elias nodded once. Then he walked toward the fire pit near the center of the yard. The entire crowd watched silently as he crouched beside the weak flames left from the morning cook fire. Dakota remained perfectly still. The blind woman did not speak. Mercer's smile slowly disappeared. Elias held the map over the flames for one long second. Then he let it fall into the fire. Gasps broke through the crowd immediately. Mercer lunged one step forward before stopping himself. The old leather curled black at the edges as flames swallowed the carved trails and hidden paths forever. Nobody moved to stop it. Not even Dakota. The Apache chief simply lowered his head slowly, almost respectfully, while the map turned to ash beneath the gray afternoon sky. Mercer stared at the burning fire like a man watching his entire future disappear. "You fool," he whispered. Elias stood slowly beside the flames. "Maybe," he answered, "but some things ought to stay buried." The blind woman smiled then. Small, tired, peaceful. The kind of smile that only comes after carrying a burden too long. Around the farm, the tension that had gripped the prairie since dawn seemed to loosen all at once. Horses lowered their heads, calmly into the cold wind. Townspeople slowly stepped back toward wagons and fences. Even Sheriff Brennan looked lighter somehow, like a man waking from a bad dream. Mercer climbed onto his horse without another word. His two riders followed behind him quietly. No threats, no speeches. Just three small figures disappearing back across the empty plains with nothing left to chase anymore. Snow began falling before sunset. Thin white flakes drifting across the farm while Apache riders prepared to leave. Dakota approached Elias one final time beside the repaired fence line. He removed a small silver bead from the braided reins of his gray stallion and placed it carefully into Elias's rough hand. My mother says horses remember the hearts of good men, Dakota said quietly. Elias glanced toward the blind woman sitting peacefully on the porch wrapped in her wool shawl. Will she stay? Dakota looked toward the falling snow. Until winter passes. Elias nodded once. Then the house will stay warm. Dakota studied him for a long moment before climbing into the saddle. By nightfall the riders were gone. Hundreds of horses faded slowly into the snow-covered prairie until only hoofprints remained beneath moonlight. Weeks later, people in Red Hollow still argued about what truly happened at Elias Turner's farm that winter. Some claimed there had been soldiers hidden beyond the hills. Others swore the Apache riders numbered in the thousands. But Elias never corrected any of them. Every evening after chores, he simply sat beside the stove while the blind woman listened to the wind against the old farmhouse walls. Sometimes she smiled before distant horses could even be heard. And sometimes, late at night when the prairie turned silent beneath the snow, Elias could have sworn the lonely old house sounded less empty than it had in years. Out on the frontier, people often believed gold was the most valuable thing hidden beneath the earth. But they were wrong. The rarest thing was kindness given without asking who deserved it.